Hello, everybody. Welcome to a series of dialogues on global history. Today, we will discuss on positionality. And we have a special guest who is an expert of African history, Professor Andrea Eckert of Berlin Humboldt University. Andreas and me, we have worked for more than 6-7 years, or even less than 10 years at least, anyway, within the framework of Global History Collaborative. And we visited each other to Berlin, to Tokyo, and Professor Eckert visited Tokyo, I think several times already, and made some lectures. So some of you know him, certainly. And today, from Tokyo College, Assistant Professor SHAKUTO Shiori is with me, and she will ask some questions to Professor Eckert. And I forgot to introduce Professor Eckert's work in Japanese, which is included in this book, Global History no Kanonsei. And in this book, he discussed, or he introduced studies on global history in Germany. And of course, in addition, he has published a lot of books on global history as well as on African history, both in English and in German. So now, Shiori, it's your turn.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Professor Eckert, for giving us opportunities to ask you some questions about global history and your specialization. So I think the first questions that I had for you was really to do with the relationship between area studies and global history. So I think many people perceive you as an area specialist, and I think you wrote in your profile page that you are a historian of Africa, but you're also a global historian. So can you be an area specialist and a global historian at the same time, or is it an oxymoron?
I'm sorry to intervene before the answer of Professor Eckert. I forgot to introduce Shiori because she's not a historian, global historian. She's an anthropologist, specialized in Japan and gender. Please, now it's your turn.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't think that it is an oxymoron. I think even that you have to be at least to some degree an area specialist in order to be a good global historian. Let me explain. I think that as an area specialist, one of your main things or the main elements is to know something about some place, to appreciate that you need to know the languages, the culture, the history of a place very well in order to talk about it. And I think this is a very good starting point then to think about broader connections in the world. And as an area specialist, you are more likely to appreciate that if you want to talk about other places in the world, that you need to be cautious, that you need to know something about it before you can talk about it. So I think area specialist, or in my case, an historian of Africa, has been very important to become a, how should I say, humble global historian, insofar as I think we shouldn't talk too easily about other world regions without really knowing them. And on the other hand, I think global history is not the history of everything, but the history of connections, entanglements, and the substance and even the limits of entanglement. So for me, as an historian of Africa, I could start in a specific place in Africa and just ask, how is this place connected to other places in the world through trade, through migration, also maybe through shared religious institutions and so on and so forth. And of course, the point would be always not to assume that there are entanglements everywhere, but also to look at possible limits and to really ask how important are these connections. And I think for these kind of questions, being an area specialist is a very important thing, instead of approaching the world from on top and this kind of broad perspective. I think it's very important to start at a small point, and that can be Africa, Japan, South Asia, or even Germany.
Thank you. That's I really liked your expression, Humboldt global historian, and really appreciating the local specificity in order to talk about connections, and not just connections, but also the limit of connections. I think that leads to my second question then. My second question was, how do you then extrapolate the findings from your field, which is very region specific, to then make contributions to larger debates in global history? And whose debates are those in global history?
Yeah, let me choose the example of labor history, which is one of my main fields of interest. I think for a long time it has been assumed that labor history is mainly about wage labor and and the working class and kind of organized labor. And there is always this tendency that people working on the North Atlantic area tended to generalize or even globalize their insights, although the reference is only a rather small region compared to the rest of the world. And being an historian or labor historian of Africa and just looking at certain constellations in Africa, for instance, the fact that wage labor is not the normal form of labor relations, that people very often mix wage labor with other forms of labor, and that there is no straightforward development from unfree labor to free labor. These questions that have derived from detailed research in South Asia and Africa and Latin America then have helped to rethink global trends in labor history. And people came to the idea that, yes, I mean, what we have assumed is the normal form. It's not the normal form at all. It's even the exception to trends in other parts of the world. So I think in this kind of area-based history has very much helped to shape assumptions about global labor history. And also, for instance, how we define labor, that labor is not only wage labor, but labor can be many things depending on the region you are looking at. These are just a few examples to show that this kind of area-based study can help to shape kind of generalized or universalized ideas, but that have been only derived from the study of North America or Western Europe.
Thank you again for great answers. I think the similar thing can be said about the idea of labor, as you say, that what in one society might be considered labor might not be considered a labor in your areas of specialty. So it's really interesting to see that dialogue in those ways. Okay, I would like to move on to my second set of questions, which is to do with positionality, your positionality as a historian of Africa. So you mentioned in a book chapter that Haneda Sensei just showed to all of us, The Global History in Germany, which was published in 2017, that the colonial history must not take for granted the perspectives of people who have been colonized. So my question is really, how do we gain these perspectives as a historian?
I mean, there are two things. The first is, of course, that for a long time there has been the assumption there are the colonizers and the colonized, and they are the two groups are more or less share the same assumptions, speaking the same language, have the same interest. And why this has been deconstructed for the colonizers quite a while ago, I think it is also important to see that not all colonized people had the same interest and the same attitude towards colonialism, were at the same level. And I think this is the first important point. And the second is, how do we get there? Of course, I mean, for African history, we have relatively few written sources around until, let's say, the mid-20th century, although recent research has very much shown that Africans wrote much more than we have often assumed. So there are many more, let's say, private letters, private notes, diaries, and so on around than we had thought, not only in mission circles, but in broader society. But secondly, of course, we have to read many colonial archives against the grain, so to speak, just to filter out what could be drawn from these European and very Eurocentric sources to get a sense of what African perspectives were. And there we get very interesting ideas about also how different Africans thought about certain things when Europeans complained that certain people would obey and others not. And just to end with a small example, the fact that in so many European sources, you find this image of the lazy African, the Africans who do not want to work. I think it's a very interesting insight, because it is not that Africans were lazy, but these sources very nicely show, I think, that Europeans were not able to control Africans as they would have liked it, that Africans didn't work as hard and obeyed to all kind of forced labor as Europeans wanted them to do. And of course, to explain that Africans are simply lazy was a very convenient explanation for Europeans, but I think it shows also a lot of resistance and a lot of agency on the parts of Africans. So I think we are able to get some of these perspectives, even though the sources in the case of African history are limited.
It's really interesting to reinterpret some of the colonial sources by giving agencies to the people. I think that's a really important point. My second question that I had with regard to positionality was really, how do you address your positionality in the field, both personally and in intellectual terms?
I think first of all, I had to become aware of the fact that there's this long tradition of seeing things in the North Atlantic realm as normal and the rest as exceptional. That was a kind of position I was growing up with, and I was in a way also trained with. And just to realize that there could be different takes on the world depending on from where you are speaking and where you are standing, and that also history is very much also shaped by regional, national, and local context, and that the way that we write history is not kind of universal or objective, but shaped by a lot of different points of view. So the way you see the Second World War is very different from Germany than, let's say, from Kenya or from Argentina. So I think this is important just to get the insight that there's no this one way to see things, but that there are a number of ways to see things. And especially for me as an historian of Africa, working on a continent that has been denied for such a long time, that it has its own history, it has its own perspective. I think it's all the more important to listen carefully and respectfully to what the perspective of colleagues working in Africa are. It is not that I share then all their views, of course, and I think maybe some views are more valuable than others, but I think the importance just to accept that global history is about a huge number of diverse perspectives, and that we have to start to respect these perspectives before we then try to analyze them. I think it's an important point, and this is the way I approach positionality, both intellectually and personally.
Oh, that's great. So global history is not just study of connections and exchange, but it's also a process of exchanging these conversations about the shared history.
Exactly.
All right. The final set of questions that I had for you was really related to the second, which is to challenge the knowledge production systems through global history. So here I want to bring an example of Japan and Japanese studies. So themes and focus that's covered in the discipline of so-called Japanese studies that's pursued inside Japan and outside Japan can be quite different. I wonder if there's any differences between this African history that's pursued inside Africa and outside the continent. And what are some of these differences, and why do you think there are these differences?
Yes, there are a lot of differences. I think there has been a moment of convergence, so to speak, in the 1960s, early 70s, after the independence of many African former colonies, where there was a kind of shared interest, but also a lot of material support and ideological support in Africa for academic history writing and research. This has changed a lot, and now we have let's say, historians in Africa working under very precarious conditions, and historians of Africa and other parts of the world who are still, in most cases, better off. And I think this material basis for historical research is something we shouldn't underestimate. For instance, global history, as we all know, involves a lot of travel, many different archives, and so on and so forth. This is something most historians in Africa can't afford. So that's why they are also very skeptical about global history. That means connections, going to many places, something the others can do, but they can't. But there's also another reluctance that there's the idea that global historians do not respect local languages, local knowledge, and so on and so forth. And this is something many historians in Africa very much emphasize on, also on the regional history. And they're still very much looking for history as part of nation building, something that has been deconstructed, so to speak, in many Western historiographies. So there are also very fundamentally different approaches to that. And there's also a certain feeling that then rich Westerners come with their topics and kind of implement them in Africa, saying this is the way you have to do it. So there is a kind of tension and very different ways of looking at history and very different interests. And I think it's something we have to keep in mind when we think about topics we are doing and how they might be perceived in Africa. Not that we should leave them aside, but just also think what kind of impact that might have for research in Africa, because there's this huge hierarchy in many ways of the material conditions of doing academic history.
Yeah, you alluded to many structural issues in the production of knowledges. I wonder, so this is my last question for you, which was, how do you come to your research topic? And you mentioned earlier that some of the research topics that that are of interest by certain population and other population could be very different because of the academic structure, but also on the national interest, etc. So for you, has there been a change in your interest, for example, through the convergence and exchanges of ideas with the local scholars?
Yes, definitely. I mean, let me put it like this. Now, at this point of my career, I have the luxury not to have to be too trendy. I mean, I can choose whatever I want, but the question is still why I choose certain topics. And of course, first of all, I mean, talking, discussing, exchanging with colleagues in Africa very much shaped my work and made me think about a lot of questions I didn't have before, and seeing things differently. But also, and this is one of the, I think, very important effects of global history, as an historian of Africa coming from Germany, talking about colleagues working on Japanese history or South Asian history or Chinese history also helped me to rethink and shape my questions I have for African history. So I think this kind of exchange and not talking to the usual suspects, so to speak, but talking to people who might have a very different view on certain themes very much helped me to think about new themes and to develop new themes. So I think this is one of the main, or should I say, impulses for me to choose certain research topics and to follow them.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much for answering all my questions.
Thank you both. And I know that, Andreas, you before the COVID-19 crisis, you made a lot of travel around the world from one place to another. And under this crisis, your life has changed completely, I imagine. And you have discovered something new, or you are now comfortable with your new life?
It's a mix. Of course, it's also, I mean, I discovered that being in my apartment for a number of weeks also helps me to be more focused on things and writing and so on. So I wrote probably more consistently than I could before. On the other hand, I also miss very much this kind of traveling and exchange. Not so much the airports or the flights, but then being in different places. But it's a different thing I recently talked to Jeremy Edelman, who will also be your guest, I think, in a few days. And he told me, yes, I mean, we can talk at this and this point, because then I have a talk in Rome. And of course, but the talk was not in Rome, but it was online, on video, but with colleagues in Italy. And I think this makes a huge difference if you go there, exchange there, but also see the place and so on. I think that's very important also to get new insights and so on and so forth. So this is something I very much miss indeed. And this is, and I know that we have to reduce travel and flights in general, even after COVID. But I think it is still crucial and very important to have also this personal exchange, not with a screen between us. So this is something I miss, because this was for me always a very important, how should I say, part, and a positive part of my academic life, that I'm not only sitting somewhere here and do not move. I'm not an armchair scholar, but also someone who is going out and meeting with a lot of different people. And that is something positive about global history, that I also went to places I haven't been before, that I have been to Tokyo, I think 4 times since 7 years ago. I think this is crucial. So you learn a lot of new things, which not only help to open up your horizon, but also help you to do your own specific work. So the way I talk to Masashi and other people in Japan and Japanese scholars helped me to rethink or to reframe some of my questions I have to African history. I think that's, as I said earlier, is one of the big advantages or positive effects of global history, but also global history that is lived and not only kind of performed on screen or at your own desk.
Thank you very much, Professor Eckert. Certainly, we are looking forward to welcoming you once again in person at Tokyo in the very near future. Thank you very much for your participation, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.